fields of southern Georgia breathed like a living thing, exhaling heat and rot beneath a sky too wide to care. By day, the land pretended to be orderly. Rows straight, commands followed, pain hidden behind lowered eyes. By night, it remembered everything. The dirt held footprints longer than it should have. The trees leaned close, listening. Martha learned early how to disappear while standing still. She kept her gaze soft, her hands busy, her mouth closed. Survival lived in the space between notice and neglect. The others said she was lucky. She knew better. Luck was loud. Luck attracted attention. When the new overseer arrived, the air changed. He did not shout the way the others had. He spoke gently, almost kindly, as if cruelty were a private agreement between him and God. His boots were always clean. His smile never reached his eyes. Men like him didn't need to be watched. They needed to be remembered. Martha felt him before he ever touched her life. The rhythm of the days shifted. Punishments became slower, more intentional. Shame replaced the whip, and shame lingered longer. The plantation learned a new language, one spoken in pauses and unfinished threats. At night, Martha lay awake, counting breaths that were not her own, listening to the earth settle beneath the weight of everything unsaid. Fear moved through her like a fever, but something else followed close behind it. Something colder, sharper. A thought she refused to name. History would later reduce what happened to a sentence, then a rumor, then a warning. But in the beginning, there was only a woman, a silence stretched too thin, and a moment waiting to be claimed. The day the new overseer arrived, the plantation did not announce it with bells or raised voices. There was no spectacle, no sudden breaking of routine. Instead, the change moved quietly, like a shift in weather that animals sense before humans do. The horses stamped more than usual. The dogs refused to sleep. Even the cicadas hesitated, their song thinning as if the air itself were holding its breath. Martha noticed the difference before she saw the man. The morning work began on time, yet something in the way orders were given felt altered, tightened. The usual barked commands had been replaced with calm instruction, spoken evenly, without haste. Calm, she knew, could be more dangerous than rage. Calm meant intention. Calm meant time. When he finally stepped into view, he did not look like trouble. He was not broad or red-faced, not loud with drink or sweat. His coat was clean, his posture upright, his movements economical. He carried himself as though the land already belonged to him, not just on paper, but in spirit. He observed more than he spoke, and when his eyes settled on someone, they stayed there a moment too long, as if measuring something invisible. The old overseer had been careless with his power. He struck when he was angry, punished when he was embarrassed, shouted when he felt ignored. Pain came fast and loud, and when it was over, it was over. The new man did not rush. He watched hands tremble before deciding whether they deserved correction. He let mistakes linger, allowed hope to surface, then withdrew it with a single sentence spoken gently, almost apologetically. Martha felt his presence like a pressure behind her eyes. She kept her head lowered, her back straight, her movements precise. She had spent her life learning the shapes of danger, memorizing the patterns of men who believed suffering was their right. This man was different. He did not seem to enjoy cruelty in the obvious way. He treated it like a craft, something to be applied carefully, for maximum effect. Within days, the quarters began to change. Conversations shortened. Laughter became rare and quick, cut off the moment it appeared. People stopped asking questions, not because they had learned the answers, but because they had learned the cost of curiosity. The overseer never punished the same way twice. Inconsistency became his rule, keeping everyone slightly off balance, unsure of what would provoke him. Martha watched from the edges. She saw how he separated people with subtlety, praising one worker within earshot of others, then finding fault with the same person the next day. He planted suspicion like seed, watered it with silence, and waited. He understood something fundamental: isolation did half the work for him. A person alone would break faster than one surrounded by shared anger. The first real sign came when a boy dropped a basket of cotton. It was an accident, the kind that happened daily, usually earning nothing more than a curse. The overseer approached slowly, knelt to examine the spilled fibers, and smiled. He asked the boy how long he had been working. He asked about his mother. He asked whether the basket had felt too heavy. His voice was soft enough to invite hope. Then he told the boy to pick it up again, over and over. Each time the basket slipped, the overseer corrected him, not with blows, but with words sharp enough to cut. He spoke of carelessness as a moral failing, of clumsiness as proof of ingratitude. By the time the boy's hands bled, no one else could look away, and no one dared intervene. When it ended, the overseer simply nodded, as though a lesson had been successfully delivered. That night, Martha lay awake, staring into the dark. She did not cry. Tears required a belief that release was possible. Instead, she listened to the sounds of the quarters settling into uneasy sleep. She felt something old stir inside her, something she had buried beneath obedience and silence. It was not rage, not yet. It was recognition. She began to see the overseer everywhere, even when he was not present, in the way people flinched at footsteps, in the way voices dropped instinctively, in the careful way mothers touched their children, as if bracing them for an invisible blow. His cruelty had no single target. It spread outward, contaminating every interaction, every thought of tomorrow. Martha understood then that this man was not merely enforcing order. He was reshaping it. He was teaching everyone how small they were meant to feel, how thoroughly watched, how completely owned. And beneath that understanding, deeper and quieter, came another realization. Men like this did not stop on their own. They had to be interrupted, disrupted, undone. The night it happened did not arrive suddenly. It crept in on a slow wind, dragging the heat with it, thick and suffocating. The quarters were restless, bodies shifting on thin pallets, the air heavy with the smell of sweat and damp earth. Sleep came in pieces, easily broken, and Martha lay awake long after the others had surrendered to exhaustion. Nights had become dangerous in ways daylight never was, and everyone knew it, though no one spoke the knowledge aloud. She heard the footsteps before she understood what they meant. They were measured, unhurried, unfamiliar in their restraint. Not the stagger of drunken men, not the careless tread of those who believed the dark concealed them. These steps carried purpose. Martha held her breath, listening as the sound passed one doorway, then another. Somewhere, a woman stirred and went still. Somewhere else, a child whimpered and was hushed. The door opened without force. No splintering wood, no sudden violence. Just the quiet surrender of a latch turning, as if the night itself had invited him in. Martha did not scream. She had learned long ago that sound did not summon rescue, only witnesses who would later pretend they had heard nothing. She sat up slowly, her body obeying a script written for survival. He did not rush her. He stood just inside the doorway, letting his presence fill the room. The overseer's voice was low, controlled, almost gentle. He spoke her name as though it were something he owned, something he had been waiting to use. He told her she was being noticed. He told her obedience was appreciated. He told her that attention could be dangerous if mishandled. What followed was not chaos. There was no struggle loud enough to wake the quarters. No marks left where others could see them in the morning. That was part of his design. He left her with nothing she could show, nothing she could point to as proof. Pain faded. Fear did not. He understood that memory could be a sharper tool than force. When he was gone, the silence was unbearable. The room felt smaller, the walls closer, as though they had shifted inward while she was not looking. Martha sat there for a long time, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing shallow. She waited for something to happen. Tears, shaking, collapse. None of it came. Instead, there was a strange clarity, as if a veil had been lifted from her thoughts. By morning, the plantation looked the same as it always had. The sun rose. Orders were given. Work began. No one asked questions. No one mentioned the night. This, too, was part of the cruelty. The world's refusal to acknowledge what had been done pressed down on her more heavily than the act itself. It told her she was alone in it. But Martha was not the same woman who had gone to sleep the night before. Something had shifted inside her, not broken, not erased, but hardened. She moved through the day with a heightened awareness, noticing details she had once ignored. The way the overseer lingered near certain doorways after sunset. The way he chose women who were known for their quiet. The way he carried himself afterward, as though daring the world to accuse him. Others noticed the change in her, though they could not name it. Her silence deepened, but it was no longer empty. She listened with an intensity that unsettled those around her. She remembered everything. Times, movements, patterns. Fear still lived in her, but it no longer ruled alone. It shared space with something colder, more deliberate. At night, sleep became a negotiation. When it came, it brought no comfort, only images that replayed themselves with merciless precision. Yet even in those waking dreams, Martha found herself observing rather than reliving, as if she were studying an event that had already sealed its meaning. The overseer had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and in doing so, he had revealed himself fully. The incident did not mark her in the way he intended. He believed shame would hollow her out. That fear would make her smaller, easier to manage. Instead, it carved something sharp and focused into her awareness. She understood now that what he took was not the worst thing he could lose. Power, she realized, depended on belief, and belief could be broken. In the days that followed, she watched him with a patience that surprised even herself. She learned his habits, the rhythms of his confidence. She saw how certain moments made him careless, how certainty bred vulnerability. Each observation settled into her like a stone dropped into deep water, sinking quietly, waiting. What happened that night became the axis on which her life turned, dividing before from after, innocence from knowledge, endurance from intention, and though no one else could see the mark it left on her, Martha carried it with her everywhere. A silent record of violation transformed slowly into resolve, into something that would not be undone. The shift did not announce itself. There was no moment when the overseer's authority cracked open for everyone to see. Instead, it thinned, stretched so gradually that at first only Martha seemed to notice. Power, she understood now, depended on rhythm. As long as the days moved as expected, as long as fear arrived on time and punishment followed predictably, control felt absolute. What unsettled people was not rebellion, but uncertainty. It began with small things that could not be traced back to her, not cleanly. A gate left unlatched just long enough for livestock to wander before dawn. A tool misplaced, not lost, simply shifted from where it was meant to be. Work slowed by minutes rather than hours, delays subtle enough to look like accident or fatigue. The overseer noticed, of course. He noticed everything. But noticing was not the same as understanding. Martha watched him grow sharper at the edges. His calm remained, but it took effort now. His pauses lengthened. He asked more questions than before, though he still pretended he already knew the answers. Each disruption forced him to react, and reaction was a kind of weakness. Authority worked best when it seemed effortless. The moment it had to explain itself, it risked appearing fragile. The people around her felt it too. Even if they could not name it, they began to glance at one another when mistakes went unpunished or when punishment came late. The overseer's timing faltered. Once, a man expected to be struck for speaking out of turn, and was instead dismissed with a look of irritation. The absence of violence confused him more than the blow would have. Confusion spread faster than fear. Martha did not encourage anyone openly. She did not whisper plans or plant ideas with words. That was too dangerous. Instead, she allowed possibility to exist. She let others see that not every misstep ended in suffering, that the overseer was not omnipotent, that his gaze did not reach everywhere at once. She moved carefully, always staying just within the boundary of plausibility. The overseer began to sense that something was wrong, though he could not locate the source. He tightened rules, then loosened them. He punished one person harshly, then ignored another for the same offense. His inconsistency, once a tool, turned against him. People could no longer anticipate his reactions, and so they stopped trying to please him. Survival shifted from obedience to awareness. At night, the quarters changed. Silence no longer meant submission. It meant listening. People lay awake not only in fear, but in thought. They measured risks. They remembered moments when the overseer had been distracted, times when his authority had failed to materialize. Stories were not shared openly, but glances carried meaning. A raised eyebrow, a pause before answering, a shared understanding that something was no longer fixed in place. Martha remained outwardly unchanged. She worked as she always had, kept her head lowered, her movements precise. That was her greatest protection. The overseer watched her more closely now, though he did not know why. She had become a point of disturbance in his thoughts, a presence he could not quite account for. He told himself it was nothing, that she was quiet, unremarkable, easily managed. Yet he found himself thinking of her when things went wrong. When a lock jammed or a message failed to reach him, when a worker met his gaze without flinching for half a second too long. Suspicion hovered at the edges of his mind, but suspicion required proof, and proof required clarity. He had neither. The plantation itself seemed to resist him. The land grew stubborn. The heat pressed harder. Animals startled more easily. He interpreted these things as inconveniences, as irritations meant to test his patience, never considering that his control relied as much on perception as force. He believed fear alone sustained him, not realizing fear could change its shape. Martha understood that the most dangerous moment had not yet arrived. A weakening authority often lashed out before it fell. She felt the tension building, sensed the overseer's growing need to reassert himself in some decisive way. The plantation balanced on a thin edge between order and rupture, and everyone felt it, even those who pretended not to. What mattered was that the illusion had cracked. The overseer was no longer inevitable. His power could be delayed, diverted, questioned, and once that knowledge existed, it could not be erased. It lived in the pauses between commands, in the way people breathed a little deeper when he turned his back, in the understanding that control was not a law of nature, but a fragile construction, one sustained only as long as everyone agreed to believe in it. The incident was meant to remind her of her place. That was its purpose, clear in the way it was arranged and delivered. It took place in daylight, where the overseer could be certain it would be witnessed, remembered, and quietly understood by everyone present. Humiliation, he believed, worked best when it was shared, when the shame belonged not only to the person marked by it, but to all who saw and learned to fear the same fate. He chose a moment when the work was already heavy, when the sun pressed down and patience ran thin. He called Martha forward without raising his voice. The calmness of it drew attention faster than shouting ever could. People stopped what they were doing, not because they were told to, but because they knew something was about to happen, and that looking away would not save them. He accused her of a small offense, something barely worth naming. The charge itself did not matter. What mattered was the imbalance, the reminder that explanation was a privilege she did not possess. He spoke slowly, carefully, shaping each word so it cut without sounding cruel. He asked her questions he did not expect her to answer. He waited for silence and treated it as confirmation of guilt. Martha stood where he placed her. She felt the weight of every watching eye, the familiar heat of exposure crawling over her skin. This was the moment he believed would break her open, empty her of whatever quiet resistance he suspected. He expected tears trembling collapse. He expected to see fear bloom unmistakably on her face. Instead, something else happened. As he spoke, as his voice washed over her with its practiced authority, a strange detachment settled in. The noise of the field faded. The presence of others blurred at the edges. She saw him clearly, more clearly than she ever had before, not as an untouchable force, but as a man performing a role he desperately needed to believe in. She noticed the slight tension in his jaw, the way his hand hovered near his belt, not out of necessity, but habit. She noticed how carefully he avoided raising his voice, how much effort it took to maintain his composure. She understood then that this display was not only for her. It was for himself. He needed reassurance as much as the plantation did. The humiliation did not land the way he intended. It did not hollow her out or reduce her to something smaller. It clarified. In that moment, fear condensed into something hard and usable. She realized that everything he did depended on repetition, on everyone responding the way they always had. If even one part of the exchange failed to follow the script, the illusion wavered. She met his gaze. Not defiantly, not long enough to be called a challenge, but steadily, without the frantic avoidance he expected. It was a small thing, almost nothing, but she felt the shift immediately. His words faltered, just slightly. He recovered quickly, but the pause existed. It lived between them, undeniable. Those watching felt it too. They could not have explained it, but they sensed that something had not gone as planned. The overseer dismissed her with a gesture meant to appear magnanimous. He turned away, as though satisfied, but satisfaction did not follow him. He had asserted his power, and yet felt it slip through his fingers. Martha returned to her place among the others, her body moving on instinct, while her mind remained sharply awake. Shame did not cling to her the way it once might have. She understood now that what he offered her was not a truth about herself, but a performance meant to reinforce his position. Once seen that way, it lost its power to define her. That night, she did not lie awake replaying the moment with dread. She examined it instead, turning it over, studying its edges. She saw how close he had come to losing control, how much he relied on predictability. She recognized that his need to humiliate her publicly had been born of insecurity, not strength. Resolve did not arrive as a dramatic vow or sudden courage. It settled quietly, like a decision already made. She understood that waiting for mercy was pointless, that endurance alone would only prolong what was inevitable. The overseer would continue to escalate, to test, to assert himself more violently until something gave. What had been meant to crush her instead removed the last of her hesitation. Fear still existed, but it no longer dictated her choices. It became a factor to be accounted for, not a master to be obeyed. She began to think not in terms of survival alone, but of consequence. of cause and effect, of what actions could alter the balance that had been imposed on them all. The plantation continued its routines, unaware that a line had been crossed and redrawn. To everyone else, it was another punishment, another day endured. To Martha, it was the moment clarity eclipsed terror, when she saw not only what he was capable of, but what he was not, and in that understanding, something inside her settled into place, firm and irreversible. The moment arrived without spectacle, without the chaos people later expected when they tried to imagine it. There were no raised voices to mark its beginning, no sudden gathering of witnesses. The plantation slept unevenly, the way it always did, half alert even in rest. The air was heavy, pressing close to the ground, carrying the low hum of insects and the distant creak of wood settling into itself. Martha moved through the dark with a steadiness that surprised her. Fear walked beside her, but it no longer led. She knew the risks, had weighed them until there was nothing left to measure. What remained was inevitability, the understanding that this night was not chosen so much as revealed. The path to it had been laid stone by stone, each humiliation, each violation, each tightening of control guiding her forward. The overseer did not expect resistance. Expectation was his weakness. He believed authority followed him like a shadow, that it existed independent of vigilance. He believed the plantation itself enforced his will in his absence. That belief allowed him to relax, to trust the systems he had built, to assume tomorrow would resemble yesterday closely enough to be manageable. The space where it happened was quiet, ordinary, stripped of significance by repetition. That ordinariness mattered. It denied the act any grandeur, any sense of drama. This was not vengeance carried out in fury, not an eruption of chaos. It was an interruption, deliberate and final, imposed upon a man who had never imagined himself interruptible. Martha did not hesitate when the moment presented itself. Hesitation belonged to a different version of her, one shaped by waiting and hoping and enduring. That woman had been worn thin over years of careful survival. What remained acted with clarity, guided by a knowledge deeper than thought. She understood exactly what this act meant, not only to him, but to the structure he represented. There were no words exchanged that mattered. Anything spoken would have been false, an attempt to give shape to something that existed beyond explanation. Silence held more weight than speech ever could. In that silence, the overseer confronted a reality he had never considered, one in which his body was not inviolable, his authority not absolute, his power not protected by the world itself. The violence was precise, contained, and irrevocable. It did not linger. It did not indulge. It crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed, and then withdrew, leaving the consequences to unfold on their own. Pain followed, but pain was secondary. What mattered was the transformation, the sudden collapse of a certainty that had governed everything before it. When it was done, Martha did not stay to witness the aftermath. Witnessing was no longer necessary. She stepped back into the night, carrying no trophy, seeking no confirmation. The act had already completed itself in the only way that mattered. What would follow belonged to others, to rumor, to history, to fear reshaped into something unfamiliar. By morning, the plantation would awaken to disorder disguised as concern. Men would speak in hushed tones. Authority would scramble to explain what could not be explained without acknowledging its own fragility. The overseer would live, but not as he had before. His presence would become a reminder rather than a threat, a visible fracture in the idea of control. Martha returned to the quarters before the first light touched the fields. She lay down among the others, her breathing steady, her body heavy with exhaustion rather than terror. No one stirred. No one knew yet. The world held its breath, balanced between what had been and what could no longer continue. What she felt was not triumph. It was not relief. It was a quiet finality, the sense of something sealed shut. She understood that her life would not become easier, that consequences would arrive in forms she could not predict. But the shape of the future had changed, carved by an act that could not be undone. Long after the night released its grip on the land, the plantation would remember what happened there, not in details, but in absences, in the way power hesitated where it once strode freely, in the way fear learned it was not eternal, in the way one woman's silence became something else entirely, something that could not be taken back.